Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Introduction to the WISC-V, Australia and New Zealand. My name is Melissa and I will be hosting today's webinar. I'd now like to introduce you to Valerie O'Keefe, Consultant Psychologist for Pearson Clinical and Talent Assessment. Thank you and over to you, Valerie.
Thank you and welcome everyone to today's webinar. So welcome to an introduction to the WISC-V, A&NZ. So as you know, I'm Valerie from Pearson Assessments and I'll be taking you through today's webinar. Now, many of us are still using or just starting to transition from the WISC-IV, and it is time to update, especially when we look at some of the questions we're asking children in the old version and looking at some of the pictures that we're showing them, and it really shows us that the WISC-IV is getting a bit out of date. For example, in the WISC-IV, we have that picture of the green typewriter, and children aren't quite sure what that is, thinking it's maybe an unusual looking keyboard without a monitor. And then we show them the picture of the blackboard, whereas now in schools they have interactive whiteboards as opposed to these blackboards. So some of our images and also the verbal test questions that we're asking are going a bit out of date. So we need to move along, and we have come a long way with the WISC. You can see some of these very old tests here on the images. And this is really going back to 1930s and 40s where we had the early work in the WISC from Weschler. And what we have been using up till now is the WISC-IV Australian, and that was Australian adapted and normed. One of the differences with the WISC-V now is that it's an A&NZ test. So it's Australia, but also New Zealand adapted and normed. And this WISC-V that we have now was published in March of 2016, so just a bit over a year old now. Some of you who've been practicing for a while or who maybe who've been into a test library or museum lately may have seen this red manual, which is the first Australian WISC, and that comes from 1968. So we have been standardizing assessments in Australia for quite a while. And you can see when we look back at these older tests just how far that we have come. Even today, tests that are in the Weschler family generally come from the US first, and then they're adapted and standardized in the local countries. And this includes the UK and Canada and France and Australia and New Zealand, of course. If we look back to that early 1968 test, we can see it was adapted from the 1949 American WISC, and things moved a bit slower back then, taking 19 years to have an Australian adaptation. Today, we can adapt and standardize the test in about 12 to 18 months. Back then, there was only one manual, and the test structure was very simple. And when I show you the new test structure for the WISC-V, you'll see that it's much more in-depth and much more complex. Our age range is still 6 years, up to 16 years, 11 months, whereas back then it was a much more small age range. Back in 1968, they tested 400 children, but unlike today where we match it to the census, all the children were from Sydney, and actually they only tested boys, which is very unusual and of course would never get through ethics today. And some of the terms that we use today have really changed. Terms like feeble-minded and mental defective, these were terms that you would be commonly using as psychological descriptors back in the 40s up to the 60s. And some of those old subtests were still there. So we have come a long way, of course, with the verbal questions that we ask children as well. If we look back at those old tests, we can see that it was all pre-metric. We had questions that were very Commonwealth-centered. And this one also shows the sign of the times. How tall was the Australian average male back in 1968? About 5'7", up to 5'10" if you were quite tall. And in similarities, we can see again some of those pre-metric questions. And then things in similarities that we would never put into a children's test today. Back then were completely acceptable. Like, in what way are beer and wine alike? How are they the same? Of course, we would never ask a child that today. But back in 1968, if they knew that they both make you dizzy or drunk, they would get full credit. Some of the questions change because society's answers to questions change. So what should you do if you see a train approaching a place where the railway line is broken? Well, today we'd probably think about protecting ourselves and getting away from that danger as quickly as possible. But many years ago, the opposite was the correct answer. Go as near as possible and give them some kind of a warning. So protecting yourself would have been a 0 answer. So I'm showing you these older questions to give you an idea that there is a reason that we update tests, because the test items, the test images, the things that are appropriate and not appropriate to ask children, they change over time. Society changes, and what's a correct answer in one year, decades later, is no longer the correct answer. And tests need to keep up to date. Lastly, I'll show you a few vocabulary questions from 1968, and these were based on very post-World War II type questions. Also keep in mind when I show you these that the test was only normed on boys back then. So only normed on boys and asking questions like, what is a knife? What is a sword? What is nitroglycerin? What is espionage? What is harikari? These are real questions from the 1968 Australian WISC, and you can see that these would not be appropriate to ask children today. And it's not only until we step back years later from a test that we can see that we have come a long way and we have moved on. What was appropriate then, what was cutting edge then, is not cutting edge now. So we do need to move on. We can't keep using older tests with today's children, which is why modern IQ tests are revised about every 10 to 12 years now. So the WISC-V has been out for just over a year now. So what I want to cover today is the revision goals and the A&NZ standardization, the new test structure, what's been dropped and what's new, what are the new and more modern scoring and administration options, so how does digital play a part, a closer look at subtest changes, analysis and interpretation overview, and giving you some prices and resource availability. And then hopefully we'll have time for a few questions. We still have the traditional WISC-V A&NZ kit, and many people are still using the paper pencil administered kit. We do, however, have more digital-based options, which are iPad-based WISC-Vs. And the WISC-V on iPad is on a platform called Q Interactive, where the Q Interactive app is downloaded from the Apple App Store and loaded onto 2 iPads that communicate together. Alongside the iPads, you do need the red and white blocks, which can be used from any Weschler scale, any Weschler test that has the red and white blocks. I'll show you a bit more about iPad testing as we go along today. But these are the 2 options that we have in Australia for the WISC-V kit. Our revision goals for the WISC-V were to improve the psychometric property, to update the theoretical foundations and the test structure. This includes new subtests and new index scores, to make it a more user-friendly test, so shorter discontinuation rules, shorter times to get the full-scale IQ, and convenient digital options. Increasing developmental appropriateness, the clinical utility, and of course developing those local Australian-New Zealand norms. So the WISC-V, of course, is used as part of a comprehensive assessment, as part of a complete battery. It doesn't tell you on its own everything you need to know about the child, but I think what you'll find as we go through today that the WISC-V actually does give you more information about the child than the WISC-IV did. And we use the WISC-V as part of a complete comprehensive psychoeducational evaluation. Often that's to identify giftedness in a child, or a learning disability, or maybe intellectual disability. And often it's used to determine placement in specialized fundings or programs at school. It can also be used to determine disability that might be linked to the NDIS funding. It's used in more clinical settings for neuropsychological evaluations, and of course many people use the WISC-V in conducting research as well. The WISC-V does have a different and new test structure from the WISC-IV. Word reasoning is one of the subtests, one of the verbal subtests that's been dropped from the WISC-IV. Picture completion is one of the nonverbal subtests that's been dropped from the WISC-IV, and this has been replaced with new modern higher level subtests that tap into a different type of reasoning as opposed to just finding what's missing. And also when you add in new subtests, you don't want a test to just become bigger and bigger. You need to make space for some of those new and more modern subtests. Arithmetic has been substantially revised. It does require less numerical skill, but more problem solving. More steps required to solve the problem, but the maths is more simple. Digit span has changed in that there are now 3 parts to digit span: forward, backwards, and the new part, digit span sequencing. And we'll have a closer look at that as well. Now the discontinue rules have really been shortened. On the old WISC-IV, especially on the verbal subtests, you had a child fail 5 and sometimes 6 times in a row in order to stop that subtest. The discontinue rules have been shortened. Some subtests you can now stop and move on from after 2 consecutive failures. Other subtests have 3 consecutive zeros that need to be obtained before moving on from that subtest. But these shortened rules make the WISC-V not only a quicker administration, but a more user-friendly and child-friendly administration, the child not needing to experience so much failure before you can move on to a new subtest. We have new subtests as well: visual puzzles, figure weights, and a new subtest called picture span, which is great in that it's the first time in the WISC we've ever had the ability to measure visual and visual sequential working memory. We'll have a closer look at these in a little bit. Here's our new test structure. And I know there's a lot of information on this slide, so if we start at the top and work down, that's probably the best way to conquer all of this information. At the top, of course, we have our full-scale IQ, and the full-scale IQ is only made up of 7 subtests now. In the past, the WISC-IV, it was made up of 10. The full-scale IQ can be obtained by just administering the 7 subtests that you see in blue, which is similarities in vocabulary, block design, matrix reasoning, figure weights, digit span, and coding. These 7 are the ones that factor into the full-scale IQ. The ones that are in black are simply here to use as a substitution when needed to calculate the full scale. So for example, if block design is a spoiled subtest, visual puzzles can be used as a substitution to calculate the full scale IQ. For many administrations, you may only need a full scale. This may be a re-administration for a child who's already known to have an intellectual disability, or maybe for a very straightforward gifted assessment, where the full scale is really sufficient. For many administrations, however, the full scale will not give you all of the information you need. And in those circumstances, we'd recommend that you administer not just the 7, but the primary 10 subtests. And doing these primary 10 subtests, which you can see here, you will still get your full-scale IQ, but you will also get your new 5-factor model, which includes your VCI, your Verbal Comprehension Index, your Visual Spatial Index, your Fluid Reasoning Index, Working Memory Index, and your Processing Speed Index. So by doing these primary 10, you'll still get the full scale, but also these 5 factors. In the bottom part of the test structure, which is in a gray box, you can see that we have these ancillary index scales, and these are optional. Whenever you see something in the test structure or on the record form that is shaded in a gray box, that means it's optional. And usually what these are here for is to help you with the analysis and the interpretation of the results. The ancillary indices can be calculated if you need them to help you interpret the results. And these include a quantitative reasoning index, an auditory working memory index, a nonverbal index, the GAI or general ability index, and the counterpart to GAI, which is CPI, your cognitive proficiency. You can calculate all of these indices or just 1 or 2 depending on the referral question. Many of them, like the nonverbal index, are made up of subtests that you will have already administered as part of the primary 10. So there's nothing new to administer, for example, to calculate the nonverbal index. It's just a matter of taking what you've already administered and calculating the new nonverbal index. Some of these indices, however, do require the addition of 1 or 2 additional subtests. So in order to calculate auditory working memory, you'll be using digit span, which you've already administered, and then the 11th subtest would be the letter number sequencing. Just a note about the working memory index. The primary working memory index here in the WISC-V test structure depends on digit span and picture span. So this working memory index is a combination of auditory and visual working memory combined as one score. You need to keep in mind when looking at old WISC-IV working memory indices and comparing them to a new WISC-V working memory indice that the measurement is slightly different. On the WISC-IV, working memory index was just auditory. WISC-V, it's visual and auditory. Keep that in mind if you're looking at changes in scores over time for the same child. So just to wrap up, full scale only, 7 subtests. Primary indices, you'll need to do 10. If you need the ancillaries, you may not need any other subtests, but you may need 1 or 2, depending on which ones you're calculating. Some of the scoring rules have been simplified. The full-scale IQ is the only score where a substitution is permitted. Only one substitution is permitted when deriving the full-scale IQ. So for example, the full-scale IQ can be calculated using a substitution, like visual puzzles, for a spoiled primary subtest, like block design. However, at the other levels, like the primary and ancillary index levels, there are no available substitutions. In emergency situations where you can only get 6 valid subtests to factor into the full scale IQ can be prorated based on 6 subtests. This would be a last resort measure when you're not able to see the child again to get additional information and administer additional subtests, or when too many subtests have been spoiled and substitutions are not available. The completed record form looks very similar to a WISC-IV record form, but you'll notice there's more subtests and more indices, so a more complicated or busy looking record form, but nonetheless in the same Weschler style that you're used to. Your psychometrics for your subtest, with 10 being the mean, standard deviation 3, and your IQ and index score means being 100, and the standard deviation being 15, are all the same. Now where you find this summary page is now at the back of the record form in a fold-out section, which includes the summary page, the primary analysis page, this is your strengths and your weaknesses, and comparing index to index score. There's also now a third page to help you calculate the ancillary index scores, and then a fourth page for your process analysis. So this is all at a fold-out section at the back of the record form. How long does it take to administer the WISC-V? If you're only looking at the full-scale IQ, only doing 7 primary subtests, you'll be looking at about 45 minutes for the average child, but for the child who has intellectual disability, you'll be looking at about 30 minutes. If you need to get all 10 primary subtests administered so that you can get your full scale and your 5 index scores, you should plan on about an hour, but only 40 minutes if the child has an intellectual disability. But if you're working with gifted children who's sealing out much later on each subtest, an hour to an hour and 20 would be fine. Some of our descriptive classifications have changed as well. You can see here what we have been using on the WISC-IV includes terms like superior or borderline. And borderline has been a problematic term because it doesn't really mean anything to teachers and parents who don't know where borderline falls on the bell curve. You can see that the new qualitative descriptors include terms like extremely high, very high, and instead of borderline, very low. These are scores that are simply describing in words where does the score fall on the bell curve. These are not diagnostic descriptors. In order to find diagnostic descriptors like intellectual disability that is mild or moderate or severe, you will need to go to the DSM-5 or the ICD in order to find diagnostic categories and descriptors. Administration and scoring options for the WISC-V include the paper pencil or traditional kit option, which can be completely hand scored, or traditional paper pencil kit which has online scoring as another option. The online scoring platform is called Q Global, and this is where you take the subtest raw scores and insert them into the computer along with the age of the child, and then you can generate a score report or an interpretive report. And all the scoring, including strengths and weaknesses, discrepancy analysis, is all done for you. If you want to generate a score report, those are $3 each, but if you're doing a lot of testing, just get the unlimited annual license, which means that you can score as many WISC-Vs for 12 months as you like for that flat fee of $45. The score report will give you tables and graphs. Another option is the interpretive, which gives you not only the scores, the tables and the graphs, but also a narrative report. These are $5 each or $55 for an unlimited annual license. Here's an example of the cover page for the WISC-V report that's generated on the Q Global platform. If you get the narrative interpretive report, you will get a narrative report which can be edited by generating the report as a Word document, which means that you can go in and change and edit the report as you see fit. The narrative report and the score report will both do all of the scoring for you, including subtest scores, tables, graphs, strengths and weaknesses, discrepancy analysis, and all of the ancillary scores as well. There's also an optional parent summary report at the end. The third option for the WISC is going more paper-free, more digital. This is called Q Interactive, and it's where you don't buy the traditional kit at all. It's where you administer and score the test on the iPad. As you can see in the picture here, the psychologist is looking at the iPad. That's taking the place of the administration manual. He's also recording responses on the iPad, so the iPad takes the place of the record form. There's also a built-in age calculator, a built-in stopwatch, and all of the scoring software is also built into the iPad. The second iPad is used in front of the child, and that acts as the stimulus book. And you can see the child using the real red and white blocks to build the actual block design item. The two iPads are communicating to each other through Bluetooth. During setup of the iPads, you need internet connection or Wi-Fi. However, during the actual testing, you turn Wi-Fi off. The system actually works better when there's no internet connection, when Wi-Fi or a SIM card is turned off. If you're interested in iPad testing, we do have one website called helloq.com.au. and that is completely dedicated to iPad testing. You can also sign up for a free 30-day trial if you'd like to give it a try. Before putting tests onto iPad platforms, a lot of research is undertaken. There's 5 pieces of research that's been undertaken and published in relation to the WISC-V on iPad. This is to establish the equivalence of the WISC-V tasks and norms based on iPad. So all of this research can be downloaded for free as technical reports at helloq.com.au. Q Interactive paper administration of cognitive tasks versus iPad. There's also Q Interactive special group studies, so the WISC-V on iPad with children who are intellectually gifted and those who are intellectually disabled. There's also research looking at WISC-V on iPad with children on the autism spectrum and those who have ADHD. There's also Q Interactive iPad WISC-V research looking at coding and symbol search in the digital format and the reliability and validity of that. And then there's also Q Interactive WISC-V iPad studies with children who have specific learning disabilities in reading and maths. And all of this research can be downloaded from our website. Now a bit about the A&Z standardization process. We wanted to provide Australia and New Zealand adapted assessments, but also norms that were based on the census. And the census matched sample of children comes from both countries. The age range that we've tested is 6 years up to 16 years and 11 months. Prior to collecting any data, the content of the WISC-V was language and culturally adapted. The normative sample is based on 528 children, and we used the 2011 census from Australia and the 2013 census from New Zealand to help us stratify the data. We stratified the data collected from children based on age, gender, and also the 4 parental education levels that are reported in the census. This makes sure that we have data coming from children who are from highly educated families, families educated in the middle mark, but also lower or more basic levels of parental education being represented as well. We also look at the census to tell us where to test children, where children live, and whether they're based in urban or rural settings. We also look at ancestry, ethnicity, and indigenous status, and the rates of children is similar to the percentage based in the census. For example, 5% of our Australian sample is made up of children identified as either Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and 23% of the New Zealand sample is made up of children who are identified as New Zealand Māori. A bit of look at the technical properties for the new WISC-V. The full-scale IQ has an internal consistency of 0.96, which is very high. And the standard error of measurement around that full-scale IQ is less than 3 points. This is a look at the confirmatory factor analysis representing that new 5-factor model. This is something that needs to be done in every country that duplicates the WISC-V norms. If you'd like to read more about this 5-factor model and the validity, you can find this in the WISC-V technical manual. Another part of validity is looking at how does the WISC-V relate to other measures. And we can look at how it relates to the WISC-IV and the WISC-IV, and also some of our achievement measures like the KTA3 and the new WISC-III Australia-New Zealand. So we do have norms collected from the WISC-III and the WISC-V on children. That means that we have linking tables to link those two tests together. So more on correlations with the WISC-III. We tested 403 children on both the WISC-III and the WISC-V, and the correlations between the WISC-V full scale and the WISC-III total achievement score is moderate to high. And among the primary index scores from the WISC, the verbal comprehension index is the most strongly related to total academic achievement, which is followed by the working memory index. Because these two tests have been developed and normed together, we have simple and predictive difference tables available in both the scoring software, the iPad version, and the hand scoring, which means that you can conduct formal ability to achievement discrepancy analyses when you've administered both tests to the same child. We also have linking tables between WISC-III and the WISC-IV for younger children. In addition to collecting norms on the WISC-V, we've also collected information on special clinical groups of children, and these have been done some in just the US and many in the US as well as Australia and New Zealand. All of these studies, including those with children who had traumatic brain injury, who are on the autism spectrum disorder, for example, those who are still in the process of learning English, can be found in both the WISC-V Technical and Interpretation Manual and the WISC-V Administration Manual, both which come as part of the kit. If you're using the iPad version, you can access the full content of both manuals in a digital format, including these clinical studies. So let's have a closer look at the subtests, just focusing on what's new or what's different. Visual spatial subtests include block design and visual puzzles. Block design in its general format is the same as the WISC-IV. There are a couple of changes, however. We're starting with item 1. There's no sample item. On items 1 through 4, we're showing a model, but also showing a picture in the stimulus book. So introducing the stimulus book from the very first item. These very early items, the children get 2 trials, and following on from that, we go to the more difficult items. The ceiling has also been improved in that we have very difficult diamond items and then also very new complex designs like this one, which can only be performed when the child tries a square and then a diamond and it doesn't work and they have to find a new way, which is the new X pattern. So this is improving the ceiling of block design, more difficult items at the top end. You can see here that the items become very difficult. And on the 4 block items, there are no bonus points for going extra quickly. We only have bonus points for the 9 block items where the child has to do a very complex design very quickly. Now this column here in gray, a gray column means it's optional. This is a partial score. This is only here for an analysis tool. It's not here to change the block design score. It's here to record if the child has achieved any of the blocks in that particular design as correct. So for example, on item 4, if the child has 3 out of the 4 blocks correct, we would circle 3. And that is totaled at the end and can give you an idea of how close was the child to getting that correct. We have 4 optional process scores on block design, which allow you to analyze block design at a deeper level. This includes block design no time bonus, the one I just mentioned, block design partial score, and you can also keep track of the number of dimension errors or the number of rotation errors the child makes, and then analyze those at the end. A dimension error refers to when the child creates a design that's not a square or a diamond, but an unusual shape. That is a dimension error. All of these optional process analysis scores can be either converted, like block design partial score, from a raw score into a scaled score, or dimension errors and rotation errors can be converted from a raw score into a base rate. So for example, you may find that for an 8-year-old child, for example, that 4 rotation errors occurs at a very low base rate, meaning it's a very unusual occurrence. When you're using block design on the iPad, you'll be looking at a screen like this. What you would normally be reading in blue font from the test manual, you're then reading from the iPad screen. Here's the built-in stopwatch. You can start and stop that from the screen. And when you click on Show Picture, it makes the picture that would normally be seen in the stimulus book show up on the child's iPad. And then the child builds with the real red and white blocks. The child's response is then recorded here on the iPad screen by tapping or double tapping in the quadrants. And then the psychologist then determines if that's a 4-point response or a 0-point response, and then taps accordingly. For recording things like rotations, you can actually, using your fingers on the iPad screen, turn the block design so that it matches the rotation response of the child. The iPad will then calculate for you the degree of rotation so that you know if that's a significant degree of rotation or not. Visual puzzles is a new subtest for the WISC-V, also part of the visual spatial. Within a specified time limit, the child views a completed puzzle, which is up here, and then they select the 3 response options that, when combined, reconstruct the puzzle. So for example, we would say, I'm going to choose 3 of these pieces that go together to make this puzzle. The 3 pieces have to go next to each other. We're not stacking them on top of each other. So on this one, we would choose 1, 2, and 6. They go next to each other to make this puzzle. Then you have the child do a sample item. Now you try one. Which 3 pieces go together to make this puzzle? And you can tell the child, if you need to, that you have to turn or rotate this piece in your mind to make it fit. There is a time limit of 30 seconds, so the child needs to indicate to you by pointing or giving a verbal response the 3 options within the 30-second mark. Here's some other examples. Which 3 pieces go together to make this puzzle? The correct answer here is 1, 3, and 5. And which 3 pieces go together to make this puzzle? The correct answer here would be 1, 5, and 6. And which 3 pieces go together to make this puzzle? Remember, you have to turn and rotate to make things fit. The correct answer on this one is 1, 4, which is rotated, that fits between 1 and 6. As you can see, there are some similarities with block design, moving puzzle pieces around and rotating them in order to make them fit. However, all of the rotation here on visual puzzles is all mental. There's no physical moving of the blocks like in block design. Visual puzzles, you can see on this record form, you can score the response for the demo item and the sample item, and then Starting at item 1, the items are scored. The correct answer is always in the bold blue font. When looking at visual puzzles on the iPad, this is the examiner screen. You can see the prompt of what to say to the child is in blue font. Showing the picture, you tap here to send the image to the child's iPad, and the stopwatch can be started and stopped on the screen. I know that the correct answer is 2, 3, and 4 because I can see the green outline around those answer options. That tells me it's the correct answer. And I know that the child's tapped on 2, 3, and 4 because through Bluetooth, what they've tapped is shown up on my screen as a gray square. Now, if the child changes their mind, they can simply tap on their screen and that will show up on mine. And if I need them to clarify an answer, I can also tap or untap answers from my screen as well. So they can do self-correcting, that's not a problem. And if they only give a verbal response, that's fine. I can record it by tapping on my screen as well. Some other things that come up, if the child says, I don't know, you can tap on DK. If they don't give a response, you can tap on NR for no response. So there's some other ways of recording additional response options as well. Let's have a look at the fluid reasoning subtests. 2 primary, matrix reasoning and figure weights, 2 secondary, picture concepts and arithmetic. Matrix reasoning hasn't changed too much, but for the most part we have 2 matrix reasoning types in the WISC-V. We had 4 types in the WISC-IV, mostly 2 types in the WISC-V. The 2 types include the 2x2 matrix, like you see here, which focuses on analogical reasoning. The record form looks very similar to the WISC-IV. Here's the second type of matrix reasoning. This is serial reasoning, where something's happening in a series going across. Shape or color is changing, for example, or something size is changing. So the prompt would be, which one here goes here? Here's another example of analogical reasoning, where there's an analogy, a relationship going across and going down. So this correct answer has to work going down and going across. So which one here goes here? The correct answer here, of course, would be number 2. On the more difficult items, there is a mix of serial reasoning, and usually 2 or 3 types of serial reasoning combined with something that's analogical. So which one here goes here? This one, there's an analogy related to something to do with shapes and dots, and then something happening in a series as well. Number 3 is the answer on this one. Picture concepts is a secondary subtest, not one that you'll be administering very often in the WISC-V. Picture concepts has had a bit of adaptation for Australia and New Zealand, needing to change some of the images that you see. So, for example, if the child's choosing one from this line that goes with one from here and one from here, the correct answer here would be the ice block, the butter, and the candle. The link is that they all melt when they get hot. Here's picture concepts on the record form, the correct answer always being the 3 that are in the bold blue font. Now figure weights is new for the WISC-IV. Within a specified time limit, the child's going to view some scales with a missing weight, and they need to select the response option that's going to keep the scales balanced. So here's some scales, and this scale has one red circle on this side, but the other side is empty. Which one of these weighs the same as the red circle? We would choose number 2 because it's the same size, it's the same color, and it's the same shape, so we know it weighs the same. Then you can move on to items that the child will try on their own, and then eventually into items like this one where you're scoring the response. So the prompt is, which one of these weighs the same as this? So the correct option here, of course, is number 2. Which one of these weighs the same as this? And number 1 is the correct answer here. There is a time limit, 20 seconds for the easy ones, 30 seconds for the harder ones. They do need to give you the answer in that time limit for it to be scored. There are very difficult items that have 3 steps to them near the end of the subtest. So again, which one of these weighs the same as this? This would be an example of a 30-second item. Number 4 is the answer on this one. The record form can be seen here. There's only one correct answer, which is always the one in the blue font. Arithmetic has both picture and verbal items. The child's mentally solving an arithmetic problem within a specified time limit, which is 30 seconds. Now for the early items up to item 34, there's no repetition allowed. Sorry, up to item 19, no repetition allowed. However, for items 20 to 34, if the child needs a repetition, you can do that from start to finish, pausing the timing during the repetition and then starting the stopwatch again. And this is different than the WISC-IV. The first 5 items are all picture items followed by verbal items. Here's an example of a picture item: 4 butterflies, 5 grasshoppers, how many altogether? And then the verbal items are just read to the child. They have to do them in their mind. They're not allowed paper or pencil or an iPhone or a calculator. So the visual spatial and the fluid reasoning used to be combined into what we called perceptual reasoning. These have been separated out into 2 distinct ways of nonverbal reasoning. Visual spatial really focusing on constructional abilities, finding and figuring out how do things fit together to make a meaningful whole. Fluid reasoning is more about being a detective, trying to find out how things are related to each other, using your analogical reasoning skills to find relationships among things. And that brings us to the verbal area. Verbal comprehension is similarities in vocabulary as your primary subtest, information and comprehension as your secondary. And this brings us into the area where we're not problem solving just by using our nonverbal skills, but we're really looking at problem solving using language. Verbal concept formation, information retrieval from your long-term memory, and communication of your knowledge and being able to express what you know. Now, similarities is a primary verbal subtest. There's 23 test items. 7 of those have been retained, 8 changed, and 16 completely new. Now the verbal subtests, because they're more culturally loaded, of course, require a little bit more cultural adaptation. For example, you can see some terminology has been changed just to match more culturally relevant terminology and language. And you can see that some responses have been added in specifically for Australia and some specifically for New Zealand. Item 7, for example, whānau, meaning family, is added as a 2-point response, and item 16, words like bush, dreaming, and dream time have been added in. We have a sample item on similarities now, which is 3 and 4. And then the other items, you can see many of these pairs are new. Red and green, grapes and apples, butterfly and bee, and some of the more difficult ones are new as well. On vocabulary, we have 4 picture items and 25 verbal items. 15 have been retained, 2 of the picture items are new, and there's 13 new items as well. And again, some of these have been changed to reflect local terminology and culture. The picture items are quite simply, what is this? And the child names it to be a flower, or they might be more specific and say a daisy. Here's another example, what is this? The rest of the verbal items follow on from the first 4, which are picture items, and all of the verbals are simply read. I'm going to say some words, listen carefully, and tell me what each word means. These words are no longer found in the stimulus book. As the WISC-V is not a reading subtest, there's no benefit to children who can read or no disadvantage to children who can't read. These words are simply shown verbally, not in writing. So if you're looking for these words in the stimulus book, they are no longer there. The information subtest is looking at crystallized knowledge, those facts and figures that we have memorized in our long-term memory. There's 19 new, 9 retained, and 4 modified questions in information. And these have a lot of adaptations. You can see for items like naming a type of bird, we've added in kookaburras and magpies. We've added in kiwis and emus. For items that ask for a type of tree, there's eucalyptus and wattle trees. and of course New Zealand trees as well, like Pahutakawa trees, the New Zealand Christmas tree. So lots of information changes. Other examples of information questions: name something in outer space that was not made by people, something with strings used to make music, what do people use to send a fast message to someone far away, how does hot air rise? And you can see here that the what do people use to send a fast message to someone far away question is replacing the older question about stamps on letters. Now, some of the responses are very high-tech, like social media or text messaging. Some of the correct answers can also be very low-tech, like smoke signals, for example, can also be used to send a fast message to someone far away. The verbal subtest can also be recorded on the iPad administration. Here's an example of a verbal question from the US version: where does the President of the US live? You can see here that we have just tapped on the answer that the child has given us, and that was a 0 point, and so we would just tap on 0 points. If you do a query of the child, you can tap on query to record the fact that you have queried that. If the child gives you an answer that's not up here in the response options that can just be tapped on, you can also write here with your finger, or easier with a stylus. And there's multiple pages down here to record the answer. You might also notice there's a red light that comes on up here, and that indicates that there's an audio record option that's been turned on. So if you want to, you can take an audio record sample of the child's verbal responses, and that will allow you to go back and listen to those responses to help you get your scoring correct. Comprehension is also a secondary subtest, so one that you won't be doing as often. 13 new, 2 modified questions, and then 4 retained. And again, a lot of cultural adaptation for these particular items. These are questions that are more in the social context. Why do we brush our teeth? Why should we eat vegetables? Why do cars have seat belts? Why we use calendars? Why is it good for children to do chores? And there's a few proverbs in there as well. Now, we don't really speak in proverbs very often these days, so this is actually a way of asking a child to think in a way that's novel to them, that's not a usual or typical way of thinking, and a way that requires them some cognitive flexibility. So you might see on this question, teachers open the door but you must enter, that some children give you a very concrete answer. The teacher opens the door every morning and we all go in. Other children will give you a more higher level answer, using more cognitive flexibility, something around being more responsible for their own learning or open to the learning experience. And again, questions about things they may have heard about, like stress, but thinking about it in a new or different way. How can stress be a good thing? Again, requiring them not only to answer the question in a social context, but to use some cognitive flexibility. Our last 2 areas of the WISC-V are working memory, and we have digit span, picture span, and the secondary, which is letter number sequencing. Working memory in the WISC-V is both visual and auditory. Digit span is forward, backwards, and the new area, which is sequencing. Now for the sequencing, for your very young children, they do just need to be able to count at least to 3, and you can continue with the sequencing task. Sequencing is where you give the numbers in a mixed-up order, like 5, 2, 7, and the child has to give them back to you in numerical order from the lowest to the highest, like 2, 5, 7. Digit span allows you to do a lot of process analysis, really breaking down the forward, backwards, and sequencing components and analyzing them on their own and to each other, and also looking at the capacity for memory and longest digit forward and longest digits backwards. So there's a lot of analysis that you can do within the digit span subtest. Now picture span is a new working memory subtest. This is looking at visual sequential memory. For example, the child's going to view a stimulus page with 1 or more pictures. This is what they'll see for either 3 or 5 seconds, and then you turn the page and then ask them to point to the items they just saw in the order which they saw them. So for example, the child would be looking at these particular items from left to right, And then you would ask them to point to the pictures in the order that I showed you. Hopefully they will remember the chair, then the drum, and then the cup. The scoring is 2 points for identifying all the correct objects in the correct order, 1 point for identifying all the correct objects but in a mixed-up order, and 0 if it's wrong. The children are asked to look at the same images over and over. So for example, if we're asking them to look at the duck and the present and then identify those, amongst the things that they're choosing from, like the kite or the tire, these are items they would have been asked to remember in previous items. So these are sort of like distractors. It's causing what's called proactive interference. And so this refers to the ability to clear out your working memory store, to get rid of things that are distracting you and just focus on what you need to remember at that current time. So this is something that's built into the back end of the picture span subtest. This is what picture span looks like on the record form. You can also delve down a little bit more deeply into the picture span subtest by looking at the longest picture span, and you can also do a comparison between digit span and picture span on the record form. Letter number sequencing is the last memory subtest. It's secondary. You won't be doing it very often, but it is here if you need that additional measure of auditory working memory. Processing speed subtests, let's have a look at coding and symbol search. Coding has Form A for your younger children, which looks like this, quite similar to the WISC-IV, but some of the pairings of the shapes and the designs are new and different. And you can see the new designs here on the coding for the older children. Coding on the record form looks like this, and you can keep track of rotation errors if you want to analyze that later. Coding on the iPad is in multiple choice. So for example, if you're looking at coding here, you can see the child in coding A is presented with the items and they're tapping on what should go in that particular shape. You'll also notice that the shapes at the very bottom that they're choosing from change the order every time. So the child is not able to memorize the order of the response options because these change every time. Now remember, coding and symbol search, when they're used on the iPad, have a different raw score than if you use them on the paper pencil version. If you're interested in coding and symbol search in the digital format and learning about the reliability and the validity of those, you can find that information again at helloq.com.au. Symbol search, this is different than the WISC-IV. For your young children, we have symbol search A, where they're just looking for the correct design. Here it is, we put a quick line through it. However, if they can't find the exact design over here, they put a line through the no box. For the older children, they're looking for either of these items, and if they see either of them over here, like this one, put a line through it. Looking for either of these, but I don't see either one of them, so I put a line through the no box. There's a bit of process analysis you can do as well on symbol search. This is new. And symbol search is also on the iPad. Now, cancellation is the secondary processing speed subtest. This is the last subtest that we'll look at. And on cancellation, you're looking at all the animals and then finding each of the animals and putting a quick line through each animal, but not through anything else. Once the child's done the sample practice, they do cancellation random, and then after 45 seconds of cancellation random, they do cancellation structured, which is another 45-second task. Those are combined into your overall cancellation score. And we also have the ancillary index scores, which include your quantitative reasoning index, figure weights and arithmetic, auditory working memory index, which is digit span and letter number sequencing, your nonverbal index, which is made up of these subtests that you see here, all of which do not require the child to speak at all and are quite culturally neutral. Block design, for example, doesn't change in any country it goes to. It's always the same. So these nonverbal subtests make up a nonverbal index. The nonverbal index might be useful as a measurement of overall ability in children who are still in the process of learning English, those that have language disorders, those who may have a language impairment because they're on the autism spectrum, and maybe even those who have hearing impairment. The general ability index is made up of the subtests that do not require memory or processing speed. The memory and processing speed subtests are found in the counterpart to GAI, which is CPI, or your cognitive proficiency. Just a couple more things on interpretation before we wrap up today. Although you can do some proration and you can do some substitution for the full scale, you need to choose one or the other, not both of those. They can't be combined. And also, if you're working with children of lower ability, you may be getting some 0 raw scores at times. And these are the raw score 0 rules. For the full scale IQ, you can have 4, but no more than 4 raw scores of 0, for example, to calculate a valid full scale. And you can see the other rules here for the other index scores. In your record form, and of course on the Q Global and Q Interactive scoring, you can do a strengths and weakness analysis at the index level as well as the subtest level. You can also do a discrepancy analysis between your index scores. You can also do an analysis between some of the subtests, and some of this information about looking at scatter between subtests and looking at discrepancies between the index scores will then impact on whether or not that full scale IQ is emphasized or de-emphasized in the interpretation. So from Chapter 6 in the WISC-V Interpretation Manual, it says if there are statistical significant differences and low base rates between the subtests and the index scores, then you should think about why those differences are there and what they might mean clinically. The manual says that differences between the index scores does not necessarily invalidate the full scale, but what it does mean is that the full scale is not telling you the whole story about the child. You should interpret why the differences are there. What do they mean clinically? And you should think that the full scale IQ may be insufficient to describe the child's full intellectual abilities. And this is because, of course, 2 children can have exactly the same full scale IQ, but completely different clinical profiles, which is why the analysis at a more deep level than just full scale is important. You can calculate all of the ancillary indices on the record form, but you can also do these on Q Global. The ancillary index scores also have a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. And some useful comparisons like general ability to CPI can also be made. And I'll just see if there's any questions before we wrap up today.
Thanks, Valerie. We do have one question from Luke. So he asks, given the language load of the previous WISCs, will the nonverbal cluster in the WISC-V be sensitive enough to calculate a nonverbal IQ?
Yeah, so I'll just go back a couple of slides because I did skip through a bit about the nonverbal index. So it can be interpreted as a measure of general intellectual ability that minimizes those language expressive demands, and that would be appropriate with children who are in the process of learning English or because they have done poorly on the verbal subtest or not been able to perform at all on the verbal subtest because of some type of a language delay or a language impairment. So the nonverbal index can potentially be a more appropriate estimate of ability for those types of children. And there is some research, which I'm showing you here, that looks at children who are in the process of learning English. They don't speak English at home, parents don't speak English, and they still are learning English. And you can see that for these children, when they're compared to an English-speaking match control, that the nonverbal index shows no real difference between the English language learners and the match control group. So there are other tests like the Weschler nonverbal that can still be used, but the nonverbal index as part of the WISC-V can be used to give a good estimate of ability for those children who are either language impaired or still learning English. Are there any other questions?
We have one more question from Rochelle. She asks, can you use a MacBook and an iPad, or does it have to be 2 iPads?
For Q Interactive, it does need to be 2 Apple iPads. There's a variety of different types of iPads that you can use, but it does need to be Apple iPad. And you can, for Q Global scoring, which is when you've administered a paper pencil and you're scoring online, you can pretty much do that from any device that has an internet connection. But for the iPad administration, it needs to be 2 iPads.
Are there differences between scaled scores on the iPad versus the paper pencil tests? for example, with tests like coding?
So for all the subtests except for coding and symbol search, the raw score to the scaled score conversion will be exactly the same on the iPad as it is in paper pencil. Coding and symbol search are slightly different tasks, so the raw score you get on coding and symbol search on the iPad is not exactly the same as the raw score you'd get in paper format. So you can't take, for example, a raw score on the iPad for coding and put it into paper norms. But as the iPad actually gives you the scaled score, you don't necessarily need to do that. So for everything but coding and symbol search, raw score to scaled score conversion exactly the same. For the iPad version of coding and symbol search, there are different norms, and so those are calculated by the iPad for you. The iPad actually calculates all of the scores for you. I hope that answers the question sufficiently. Any other questions?
No, that's all we've got for today.
Okay, great. So the last slides you can see here are WISC-V and Chc Taxonomy, which are in the handouts that you've received. However, we won't be going through this in detail today. And also in some of the books that I'm about to show you, and in the handouts I've given you, and in the WISC-V technical manual, you'll find more detailed information about those clinical group studies that I've mentioned earlier, including all of the results and then a bit of a narrative that discusses the results. 3 books are available on the WISC-V, so this includes the WISC-V Assessment and Interpretation by Larry Weiss, and these books are available through the Pearson website. And the pricing of the kit and the online scoring and the extra packs of forms can all be seen here. And if you're interested in iPad testing, please go to helloq.com.au. Okay, so thank you everyone for logging on. And my contact details are here if you need to contact me. Thank you, and hope everyone has a lovely afternoon.